I apologize, everyone. We had a couple mix-ups with our Zoom uh, platform there, but thanks. Uh, my name is Angie Ulness, egg educator in Manitowoc County, and I'm delighted to introduce Leonard Polzin, Dairy Markets and Policy Outreach Specialist with us from UW-Madison Division of Extension. Leonard will lead the session today and discuss how dairy margin coverage, or DMC, can be used as an effective risk management tool. His presentation today will focus on the fundamentals of DMC, key risk consideration for dairy operations, and trends observed in previous years of the program participation. The webinar will also provide participants with an opportunity to ask questions. So we do have the chat available and the Q&A. At the end, I will moderate the questions. And thank you, Leonard, for sharing your expertise with us today.
Well, thank you much. Happy to be here. I noticed some messages saying that the chat is disabled. Keep putting questions in the Q&A for now. I know that Angie and Jackie are going to sort that out as we go along. But if you have any issues with on the technology side, please feel free to put it in there so we can address that. The few things here in order to start, kind of the process here of diving into DMC. Here's what we're going to kind of take a look at today. First, we're going to look at risk management options. So kind of what is this, collective suite of things that dairy producers have available to them, and then how they kind of fit in this broader considerations and risk management. And then from there, we'll dive into dairy margin coverage specifically, look at the details for the 2026 enrollment, kind of take a look at some historic performance of the tool, of this. By tool, I mean the policy itself. And then from there, historic performance, we'll kind of dive into the web tool. So that way, if you want to run some numbers for your individual operation, you know where to go and how to do that. And we'll answer some questions at the end and as we go along here. So again, please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A, and we'll certainly get to those. So one big takeaway here is that the enrollment, it started January 12th and it goes to February 26th. So that'll be coming up a few times here today, but I want you to make sure you are aware of that. Write it down, write it on your hand, write it on a notepad, but February 26th. So that is coming up pretty quickly here. And I encourage you to, as soon as this webinar is over, call your FSA office, make an appointment if DMC looks like a good tool for you, because there isn't a lot of the month left here, and February is a short month. So let's make sure you're getting your appointment scheduled and getting everything done ahead of time, so that way you don't miss the enrollment date. One thing I encourage you all right now is to take out your phones, because there are a few QR codes here that you'll scan, and that will kind of collectively go through as we go through the presentation. The first one is this. So I'll give you just a few moments here in order to do that. But this is kind of your survey to provide your thoughts, your input, and information to us. So as the university here, we often use your input in order to guide our research questions, the topics that we present, and all of these things. And then we frequently sit down, go through them, and figure out what are some of those big burning questions that folks have that we should be putting more information or emphasis on. So make sure you scan that and then proceed through those questions. The other QR code here is to the DMC tool, the Dairy Margin Coverage tool. So you can either scan it, or you can go to https://dmc.bozic, bozic.io, or if you just Google Bozic DMC tool, it should come up. So we'll be going through that together today, but just in case, and if you want that on your device, I encourage you to scan that. All right, so kind of kick things off here. Let's look at what risk management options are, or what that consideration set is for dairy producers. So I think a lot of times in the dairy world, where it's infinitely complex. One time I was working on a research project with a new colleague, a new faculty member, and they wanted to do something in dairy. I said, "Great, happy to help. You tell me what you want to look into." So, we sat down, established a plan, and started going through things. And they were like, I did all this analysis on stuff, but the milk price doesn't make sense to me. Um, so my question was, what milk price, right? Because we have the all milk price, we have the mailbox price, we have the Federal Order announced price, we have the statistical uniform blend price, we have the CME class 3 price, we have the CME class 4 price, and all these could be considered a milk price, right? Depending on what you're referencing and depending on, what you're trying to specifically do, and figure out from that price, right? So I think that's often why we look towards this, the futures market, that, CME class 3, CME class 4 price, to kind of give us some information, some bearing, some direction, right? And the reason for that is that the futures market, especially though that CME contract, it acts as a clearinghouse for relevant markets. So it acts like a sponge. It takes all of these different things that are going on, from politics to policy to tariffs to trade to international production to weather to whatever the most recent report is, and kind of decides, right, through buyers and sellers and hedgers and speculators and all of this to come up with what the current price equilibrium, what the market believes it should be at that any period or point in time. So, that futures price, it is going to be wrong, right? Because as we get closer and closer to the current date, we obviously get more and more correct. Why? Because we get increasing amounts of certainty as we get closer to that expiration date. But there is no evidence that the futures are biased, or that they're somehow non-representative of the greater marketplace. Of course, we have our basis, right? So the price you receive for your milk check, plus or minus that CME price, that would be your basis. So it's not like the CME price is, the benchmark or the actual price discovery mechanism that, is dictating your check. But by and large, it does seem to act like a very good market indicator, of direction, of relative change, and as reference pricing, right? I've heard more than once that when folks are buyers or sellers of product in the dairy space, they'll often reference the futures price to see, where they are at, relative to whatever their contract price will be. So, that's why we use that. That's why we reference that, and that's why even for the DMC product, sometimes when we're talking about price forecasts, that's where we're getting some of this information from. It's very interesting whenever there's a big policy change that happens. Oftentimes, you'll hear pundits or reporters refer to the CME price, right? They'll be like, well, there wasn't a big move in CME price, so the market must not expect a large impact, or at least, not a large impact in the time frame in which contracts are trading. So all of that just to kind of set the stage of where some of these underlying prices come from, and where kind of how all of this information feeds through. So another derivatives contract on the CME are options contracts. We're not going to get into, all of the details on what an options contract is or how you use them. But kind of the big takeaway here is that oftentimes in risk management, in the dairy space, when you take a look at, taking either a futures position or an options position, when you take more often than not, when you're utilizing that options position, you're doing so through what they call a put, which establishes a floor. So it's kind of like you buy insurance at a price floor. And then if the price goes below that, then you get a premium from the market. If it goes above that, then effectively you lost the premium that you paid in insurance, right? But it's another choice for calculating, the risk for future forecasts, and it kind of can act like that, sort of insurance or price floor mechanism. Um, so what does this all kind of look like? This is a CME graph, so updated, not today, but from the most recent prices from Friday. So right now, our class three price, which is that the vertical axis on the left side of the screen there. Our class three price is about 1750 and our class four price is about 1760. So the good news here is that the market is trading higher the further out you go in time, which means that, at least the market currently is expecting that prices would increase. That's always the question, right? Like, will that continue? How much of a premium is that? All of these things. Um, you know, when we kind of take a look at cheese and butter, both of those two contracts seem relatively flat, which would tell us that the market is kind of expecting a leveling off there. And for that class three price, it's hard to get a high class three price if we don't have, a strong cheese price. So, I would say take those things into consideration as you're kind of looking forward in your operation and what price risk might be. So if you're looking to do any sort of price risk management or risk management in general, it doesn't have to be price risk management. It could be, a myriad of risks that you're trying to offset. This is kind of what the standard list is of what we think about, right? You can do nothing. You can self-insure. And for some folks, that's a perfectly fine, reasonable, good choice, right? Say if you're a low debt operation, you have high equity, potentially you have high cash reserves. Maybe not doing something is a optimal choice, right? You can utilize futures and options contracts. You can cash contract with a co-op or a plant. And then on the revenue side of things, you can use DRP, dairy revenue protection. You can use LGM dairy, which is livestock gross margin dairy, and dairy margin coverage, which is what we're talking about today. The one big thing here to note is that dairy margin coverage can be used in conjunction with any other product, right? So, for example, you cannot use DRP and LGM dairy together at the exact same time to cover the same amount of production because you're effectively collecting two subsidies because both of those premiums are subsidized. So you're collecting two premiums or two subsidies, excuse me, on those same pounds of milk covered. So you can't do that, but you can use dairy margin coverage with LGM dairy. You can use dairy margin coverage with DRP. You can use dairy margin coverage with futures and options, right? And you can use dairy margin coverage with either DRP, LGM dairy, and all of those other things at the top of the list. So if you have a question on that, make sure you talk to your licensed insurance provider for those products. So that way you make sure you're staying within the rules and regulations for those products. But the big takeaway is that this DMC does not exclude you from using any of the other risk management tools that you might be using in your operation. So whenever you're choosing a tool of any sort, the big question is, what risk are you managing and what is the value? So there's all kinds of risk. There's production risk, market or price risk, financial risk, institutional, human personnel. In the econ world, oftentimes where we think about risk, we think of the income and the expense, which equals the margin, right? Income minus expense is margin. And if we can control the risk of income and if we can control some expense risk, then hopefully we can control some of that margin risk. So what are these tools that we can use to do this? On the income side, we can use futures and options. We can use DRP, dairy revenue protection, and we can use contracting if that's available to you. On the expense side, we can use futures and options again in contracts or pre-purchase, things like this. But if you're looking at tools for managing the margin, really kind of the two that stand out that have the ability to do that are LGM dairy, livestock gross margin dairy, and dairy margin coverage. So I think that's, again, here already two things that make DMC very unique is that one, it can be used with other products, and two, it's one of the two really tools that covers both that income and expense line if you're looking to protect some of your margin. So we're going to dive into some of the mechanics here. So the sign up date again is January 12th through February 26th. I'm going to say that enough times today that I hope when you dream tonight that February 26th deadline will still be in your dreams. So this year, this sign up period, the mechanics are pretty much the same. What we're doing is we're taking a milk price minus that value of a feed ration to produce 100 pounds of milk. So, we don't have the fortification, the transformation costs in there. It's just, we're using coefficients and futures market prices to determine feed value rations. And everything again is converted to that per hundredweight basis. So the milk price that we're using is that all milk price, which is the national average all milk price. And then for the feed price, it's, again, these estimates in order to figure out what the margin would be. So now, if you're kind of taking a look at some considerations in this, we provide both the milk price and the feed price risk. But when you do this and you go to sign up, you're kind of have two things to select. The first of which is the percent coverage of annual historic production, and that ranges anywhere from 5 to 95%. When we kind of take a look at previous enrollment numbers, it's pretty heavily dominated on selecting that 95% coverage level. If anybody's kind of looking at where historic enrollments have been in order to help kind of guide their decision making, that's predominantly where it's at, especially for that first now 6 million pounds of production. And the other thing that you can choose is your coverage level. Your coverage level determines the amount of margin per hundredweight that you're wanting to insure or protect against. So again, that margin, income minus feed cost, and that level that you want. So it goes from $4 to $9.50. Again, historically, we have seen a lot of folks choose that 95% coverage level at that $9.50 margin. And there is a 25% premium discount when you lock in coverage when you enroll. And when you're doing that, you're enrolling and locking in a multi-year time period. We'll get more details on that here in just a second. Just some more mechanics here to kind of visualize it. We have two tiers. We have tier one and tier two. This year, what changed in the program is we went from our tier one pounds of milk being 5 million pounds to now being 6 million pounds. So that tier one is that first 6 million pounds of annual production, annual milk production, and then we're split into these two decisions. The first decision is what margin coverage level do you want? That $4 to $9.50 margin. And that second question is that producer is that premium level. So again, we'll kind of take a look at where that is on depending on that percent coverage. So, and again, if you choose to cover any tier two coverage, it's the exact same thing. It's just for the amount that is over your 6 million pounds of annual production, and the highest margin level that you can cover there is $8. Just kind of visually here, I decided to graph the premium per hundredweight of the tier one and the tier two. So tier one is in blue, tier two is in red. And you can see that as for that tier two coverage level, it is quite a bit more in that as you kind of progress down, in that coverage level on that tier two, it does get incrementally less. But we'll kind of see what that means in historic performance here as well. So don't let any of that, scare you or deter you here. I think as we go along, some of this will kind of make sense and help frame some of the decision making around that. So the big thing for this year. So what changed? Instead of being authorized by a farm bill, this authorization came from the One Big Beautiful Bill, and the rule change was hit the Federal Register on January 12th of 2026. Which again came with the announcement of the enrollment period. So what are the major changes? The first one, production history. We have a new production history requirement for all participants. So before you had, you could have, your base history, and then you could have supplemental coverage, and then, depending on the year, enrollment period, they'd have all these things. Not the case this year. If you are enrolling, you will have to have an updated production history. So I would encourage you to call your processor right away. Processors, by and large, are aware of this and will know exactly what you're asking for. Tell them, hey, I'm looking at enrolling in the dairy margin coverage program. could you please pull up my production history and either send it to me, or some processors are sending it directly to the appropriate FSA office. So make sure you get on the horn, contact them sooner than later. And the other change that happened is our tier one coverage expanded from that 5 million pounds of annual production to that 6 million pounds. And we do have the option to lock in coverage for all 6 years at that premium discount. So, which is from 2026 to 2031. A few things with locking in that coverage. The first of which is that if you end up not producing milk in the future during that period of time, simply let FSA know, and you are not responsible for continuing to pay premium on milk that is not being produced or delivered. If that uncertainty is what's keeping you from locking in, make sure that, it shouldn't be a limiting factor. You should be able to adjust as you go along if you quit producing milk. And the other, of course, if you choose that lock-in coverage level, you do have that premium discount, which we'll kind of take a look at in more detail coming up here. So again, timeline and what you have to do. Enrollment period coming up. Deadline, February 26th. Make your appointment now, because the window is not very large and it's going to creep up sooner than we realize. So make sure you make your appointment now with the FSA office. The documentation, again, we are having an updated production history for everybody that's enrolling. So make sure that you contact your processor and have them send your milk marketing records, your statements, have them send that ahead of time here. So that way we make sure you're ready to go before your appointment at FSA. Production history, again, is required for all operations. And then you can just kind of see some of the forms that here are required, but FSA will help you out with that. The other big thing is to make sure that your premium is paid from last year in order to enroll again. And premiums are due in September of 2026 for this enrollment period. All right, production history. Again, everybody's updating, and where your new production history is going to be is the highest of 2021, 2022, or 2023. And that's if you're an existing operation. If you're a new operation, they'll extrapolate first year marketings. They'll use, they have kind of this set of different methods they can use to figure out comparable operations, averages, things like this. They can use your rolling herd average. They have the methods in order to be able to do that. So if you're new, still plan on making that appointment if this is a tool that you're considering. And if you're existing, again, when you call that processor, you need your records for 2021, 2022, and 2023. Now, the lock-in coverage option. So it would be until 2031, which is the length of the current program that's established. The coverage selection would be the same levels for the entire contract period. The premium is a 25% reduction in your premium or in your cost of the program. So you still have to pay your administrative fee and you still have your annual premiums, but let's kind of take a look at what this practically means. So normally, now let's assume that you're doing your first 6 million pounds of annual production at a 95% coverage level, and we have a margin level of $9.50. Well, right now, your annual premium would then be $8,550. If you take that discount, your annual premium is $6,412.50. Now, if you multiply that over the contract period, you're saving somewhere around $12,825. So, I would say, especially when we kind of take a look at where DMC is priced compared to other risk management options, and if you take into account that premium reduction, I think there's pretty good value for the protection that you're getting, which kind of leads us nicely into historic performance. So if we just kind of take a look at where our all milk price is, this is over the enrollment period. So all of the announced prices haven't come out for 2025 yet, so I didn't want to include that in this. Don't let that confuse you for future slides here in order to kind of frame decisions better. We did include that, but just as a pure historical perspective, over the life of the dairy margin coverage program, all milk price was about $20.71, and our feed cost was about, $11.48. Well, where does that put our average margin? About $9.23. So on average, it seems like we're about that, below that $9.50 coverage level. Um, just based on some estimates here, this morning I did rerun this with 2025 included, and our margin on average, with 2025 included, is almost exactly $9.50. So I thought that was quite interesting. Now, dairy margin coverage, it's a national program that uses all milk price for the nation, right? It's not county specific, it's not farm specific. What does that mean? It means that we're obviously going to have variation when you take into account farm level things. I would not say that that's a fault of the program. I would not say that it's a inherent detriment. What it does is it makes, it's that trade-off, right? Like you could have more specific things. Let's take LGM dairy, for example, a very specific tool where you can get, incredibly detailed in the exact things that you want and that you want covered and how you want them calculated. What's the trade-off? Complexity, time, knowledge, understanding, all of these things, right? And then there's a lot of attention that you have to put on them because it's not one and done for the entire year. It's evolving, changing. Same argument for futures contracts or options contracts, right? They're things that you have to watch, you have to pay attention to. Dairy margin coverage is, in exchange for some of that hyper specificity, complexity, it's, hey, let's find a way to make an all milk price for the entire US. Let's find a way to make a comparable feed ration for the entire US. And then let's come up with a margin so that way we can, create at least some guardrails here of what margin looks like and when we get below certain thresholds, right? So because of that, we're going to have this basis, this difference between the all milk price and your specific price, or in this case, what I calculated was the Wisconsin mailbox price. So the reason that I bring this up, again, isn't to show a deficit of the program or anything like this. It's for you to know specifically if you are utilizing any other risk management tools, right? Where you might want to make up that difference. And, possibly there's a tool out there that you could utilize to do so. So when we kind of take a look at averages over time, in 2025, mailbox for Wisconsin is 63 cents lower. We've been about 67 cents lower over the entire time period. But just keep that in mind, right? That our milk price is lower than all milk price, which, when you think about all the things that go into that, you have different class utilizations, which impact the pricing and all of this that, as you get to different regions, you would expect that. And here being cheese heavy, where the cheese market has been a bit softer, so this is what you would expect. But keep that in mind, right? That whatever number you want, 67 cents, 63 cents, lower than what all milk price is if you're looking at additional tools to help manage any of the risk that's remaining in your individual operation from their dairy margin coverage. All right, now when we take a look at performance, I just went back to the beginning of the program here and said, hey, how many times were payments triggered below $4, below $8, and below $9.50? So why $4? Why did I choose that? Because that's the catastrophic coverage level. So even if you don't select anything, you just go into FSA, you pay your administrative fee, $100 administrative fee. You can sign up for that $4 coverage and be covered for that catastrophic event, right? Out of this entire time period, that happened 2 times that those triggered payments at that below the $4 level. So I guess that's up to you if you find the value even in just signing up for a very nominal fee and having that level of production or of coverage. History would tell us that it's certainly within the range of probabilities, right? Because it did happen twice within the entire life of the program here. When we take a look at $8, why $8? Because that's the highest we can go on the tier two. This is not tier specific, right? This is just, when were margins below these certain thresholds. But I figured it was prudent to include that. So that way, if you're looking at that, below $8 dollar coverage level, you'll have some bearing of what that looks like. And over time here, we had 26.2% of the time, or 22 of the 84 months, we did have payments that were triggered below that $8 mark. And then as we go up to that $8 or that $9.50 margin coverage level, we had payments triggered 46%, 46.4% of the time. During the life of the program thus far. So the average margin of prices that have been announced is that $9.48. So we seem to be certainly above and below that as we go along, kind of as this graph would show. The green line here is our margin cost. The blue horizontal line is where the current forecast is. So everything to the right of that is forecasted prices. But the gray bars here are the periods in which we received payments. So by that, I mean the periods in which there were margins below that $9.50 a margin coverage threshold. So the big thing to take away here is that we kind of have blocks or chunks, right? We have periods of time where there's payments, some periods of time where there's no payment. And then as you kind of take a look at recent history here, we went quite some time without any payment. So I think this just kind of speaks to somewhat of the nature of dairy markets, where we'll get some argue cyclicals. You could use a variety of terms to describe this lumpiness, if you will, in margin, right? So now, again, in end of 2024 through 2025, we've had 10 months now without a payment. As we kind of take a look back over the life of the program, that's a very long time to not have a payment, right? And when we kind of take a look at our averages, if we average out the number of months that where payments were triggered versus the ones that were not, we received payments like this grouping, right? This frequency was about 4.8. Call it anywhere between 4.5 and 5 months, right? It seemed like we have these windows where payments are triggered, and then conversely, where they're not triggered seems to be about, let's call it 4.25, 4.3, right, months where then we have no payments. So I think that's very interesting in this clustering effect, if you will, of when payments are triggering and when they're not. So I think some of that is supply responses. Some of it is other market dynamics that are happening. But from that risk management standpoint, what I would encourage you to think about is historically, at least, since we've seen these fairly tight like groupings of when payments are triggered, what does your operation look like for sensitivity test it, right? Do 4 months, do 5 months, do 3 months, right? Come up with this range. What does it look like if you have that period of time with margins below 950, right? What does that do to your operation? What does that do to your balance sheet? What does that do to your cash flow? What's it do to your ability to service debt? All of these things. Because again, I'm not saying that we're due, right? But we do seem to get this clustering effect that I think gives us a great opportunity to think about, hey, if history does repeat itself, what does that look like for your risk management and your bottom line? Now, if we kind of take a look again, historic performance through the life of the program thus far, 48.5% of the time we've triggered payments, and the average net indemnity per hundredweight over the life of the program. And this is a producer that has been enrolled at the same $9.50 coverage level for the entire time of the program. The net indemnity would be that 79 cents, approximately 80 cents. and cumulatively we're about $330,000. So for a product that it's not insurance but somewhat acts like it, that you're setting a threshold, you're paying premium. So when we, as an economist, when we look at these, we kind of look at them compared to other insurance products. Um, that net benefit ratio is pretty high compared to a lot of other products that you could utilize. So the other big question then is, what if we went back 20 years or more, right? So here we're going back 25 years, just to create. Now anything pre 2019 is synthetic. It's made up. It's calculated, right? Since we didn't have the program, and we saw that payments were triggered 65.6% of the time, with our average net indemnity per hundredweight of $1.26, and almost $2 million in payments, if this program would have operated at over that entire period, right? So again, I think this speaks to a few things. One, the clustered nature of when those payments are triggered, and also just kind of some of the inherent volatility in where these markets go, right? I want to go back just 1 second here to this slide, and say that through kind of doing a deeper dive and evaluation of the program here, we've seen, at least anecdotally so far, that previous or immediate historical payments, right? So, say payments during previous enrollment period, for example, do seem to have some bearing on future participation rates. And right now, we've went through a fairly sizable period of having no payments, right? And the reason I bring that up is that, don't let that be the reason that you don't participate in the program. So again, you have to make that individual decision for yourself. And as always, past performance is no indicator of future results. But, I think it is easy for people to be like, well, we've haven't had any payments for quite some time. I'm just going to keep that premium. And again, if your operation can withstand some of these shocks, if you're well capitalized, all of these things, that might be the right decision. But I encourage you to do the math, and kind of take all of these things into consideration before just jumping to that conclusion that, well, we haven't had any payments historic or recently, so I'm going to wave my hands at it and say, not going to bother, right? Um, right now, I want all of us to kind of take out our phones again and go scan this code, and go to that DMC tool, because we're going to walk through that together here. So that way, you can kind of see where some of this information has come from, and doing some of the math for your own operation. So if there's trouble seeing my screen right now, feel free to put it in the Q&A. But just kind of a big rundown of the tool. Again, that website, dmc.bozic.io. Across the top here, we have coverage selection, net benefit forecast, our price forecast, historic performance, and our milk price trigger analysis. Now, again, we've been talking about this tier one, tier two. This is what it actually means. Right here, this tier one, you can choose your which coverage level you want, right? And for tier one, it starts at $9.50, goes all the way down to $4. For tier two, it starts at this $8, and then goes all the way down to $4. So depending on the coverage level you choose, then it calculates and then comes up with the premium amount that corresponds to that. So this is your annual historic production. Again, before we were at 5 million pounds of production. Now we're at that 6 million pounds of production for your operation. You can cover more than that, but again, that amount is covered in tier two. So as you can see, when I selected or put in 5 million pounds, the premium did change. We're going to just put that back to 6 million pounds just to keep the math consistent throughout. When you are doing your coverage selection and looking at things, make sure you are selected the year 2026, so that way it pulls through all of the information correctly. Percent coverage. This is the percent of the production. So right now, this would be 95% of this 6 million pounds covered. So if you change that coverage level, as you can see, it changes that premium. But as you do that, just make sure you know that uh, if a payment is triggered, right, you're not covering the same number of pounds then, right, as you would be if you're at that 95% coverage level. So, and then if you're selecting, again, if we say go down to this $8 uh, coverage level here on this tier one coverage, it does the math for you and changes this selector as well. So the reason that a lot of this is important is because it feeds into many of these other tabs across the top. Just in order, so I didn't have to reload and wait for that. I just opened them across the top in my screen. There's no need for you to do that when you're doing this, but if you want to, you're certainly welcome to. But as you can see, it carried through the historic production, the coverage level, and then all of the other selections from the previous page. And then what this does, this net benefit, tells you right now, based on forecast, the forecasted margin, the tier one production history, the 6 million pounds at 95%, what the total payment looks like for this time period. So right now we're at about 19,966. An easy way to see where these numbers are coming from is this price forecast. So what it's doing is it's taking this all milk price, this corn that's calculated, and then our hay price, soybean meal to come up with this total feed cost column, and then eventually our margin. So again, all milk price minus feed cost gives us our margin. And at the very bottom here for 2026, we have our $9.92 is our expected annual margin average for this time period. But where our indemnities or payments are coming from are these months here that are below that $9.50 per hundredweight time period. And then if you're interested in kind of playing around and seeing what your different selections of coverage level and percent would be, historically, feel free to do so at this table here, this historic performance. If you do that, though, I would encourage you to start in the year 2019 because previous to that, the program wasn't in existence, so you kind of get better idea for what it would have been. And then finally here, we do have this trigger analysis, which tells us that at the coverage level that you selected, which for our example is this $9.50, what would this trigger price be? So right now, we're looking at an all milk price of that around $19, and anything below that would trigger a payment at our $9.50 coverage level. You can put in your local basis there, so that way you have some additional context and idea in your idea or your calculation to know exactly what that might be. So if we just put in 63, for example, it kind of changes the math there accordingly. So, and you can go the other direction as well if you put a negative in. So then you know where the milk price trigger would have to be in order to trigger payments. So again, every operation is different, and it's, I think it's important that you understand the tool, understand where your risks lie, what risks this tool and this policy does cover, what it does not cover, all of these things, right? So, I encourage you to play around with it, take a look and see where, your right here, your total premium would be, your cover production, how much it will cost, all of these things. So, I think that's just a good, I think that's a good way to kind of take a look at your operation and what might be the best choices for you going forward. And again, if we kind of take that dairy margin coverage forecast and graph it out, you can see we're really kind of hovering around that $9.50 mark for much of the year here until the latter part of the year. You know, in the more short term, it looks like we're going to be a bit below that as we go further out. You know, looks like the market's pricing out margin a bit more favorable there. So, and again, you know, it takes into feed cost and milk price, right? So, you know, some of this is driven by milk price, some of it is driven by lower feed cost, but you know, I think that you know, we're still, you know, trying to provide some sort of risk management for the difference between those two things. Um, you know, I spend a lot of time around this time of year trying to come up with some sort of crystal ball on what the future holds for our dairy markets. And honestly, nobody knows, right? Like everybody is, we just kind of try to take our best guess, share information out there, and see what is happening and what some of these changes might be that are going on. So I'll kind of share with you what I'm seeing at least, and then you know, hopefully you can use that to inform some of your decision making, or you know, some idea of where some of these price pressures might be coming from in the coming year. So. We'll start on kind of that good news side. We've had a lot of small policy wins. So think like dairy margin coverage. We increased from 5 million pounds to 6 million pounds. And you know, a lot of those other changes are fairly favorable to the dairy producer there. We're effectively covering an additional 50 cows of milk production. So so that's, you know, that's a good thing. Whole milk for healthy kids. There's potential to clear more product there. You know, I don't think we're going to see a huge or immediate change in milk checks from that, but you know, we're clearing potentially clearing more solids through that program in the future. So there's been, you know, a lot of by small I mean small economically, not any sort of other value judgment wise, kind of wins for the dairy sector. The other thing that in theory could pull up milk prices is that new processing demand could pull up the supply for milk. If that does happen and we're short of milk, then we would see price pressure. But on the contrary, if the new demand for milk is met through enough milk supply, then we would see, excuse me, then we would see price pressure on milk price. So the other thing is that beef prices have been good, and we, you know, have seen on the farm level some increase or ability to pay bills with that. So it's a revenue source, right? And that's been strong. So we'll call that a win. And we've been exporting a lot of product. Finally, in that last one, the last category, we've been moving a lot of product. But now we'll kind of take the contrarian view here and see what are the things pulling down on markets. I think policy is always that wild card. What does labor look like? What does labor availability look like? What do tariffs look like? What are the unknown things that we don't know yet that could come about, right? I think there's a lot of policy unknowns out there. Also, you know, we have a lot more milk production here domestically in the US. So our milk supply has been going up, but the rest of the world's milk supply has been going up as well, and quite dramatically, in fact. So we're about 4% increase in world milk production, which historically speaking is a large and meaningful number. So the way that we have been clearing our excess production is through exports, but how we've been doing that is by discounting our price to the rest of the world. So the big question then hey, are we building world inventories? How long are we able to continue exporting? Because if we don't, then we would expect to see some price pressures coming through there. You know, we are seeing a lot of milk solids increasing. Cows are increasingly efficient. You know, pretty soon every farm will be on-farm processing of milk simply because our components are so much that, you know, milk will come out as yogurt, right? Our solids will be, you know, above 5.0 and will be above 4.0 protein. Like I think that time is coming. But also what that means is that every single cow, every single stall, every single hundredweight is just has that much more solids in it. which means that we're kind of getting this phantom supply of milk as well. So, and then I think that ultimately leads us to the big thing of what does market clearing look like going forward in the coming year? We have anywhere from 40 to 70% of our new processing capacity coming online, which totals about $11 billion, which takes almost a decade's worth of investment and condenses it down into just a few years here. And we seem to be supplying the milk for that. So the question then becomes, one, how do we clear the milk? And two, how do we clear the product that this is producing? So if this is where we've seen some price pressure come in already, then the big question is how much is remaining, right? So I think we could spend a day on any one of these topics, but I think the big takeaway is that hey, there's a world of things happening out there that for any given reason could support or depress milk prices, right? So I think doing that sensitivity test in your operation and saying, hey, looks like we have when payments are triggered, it's 45 months where we have these payments triggered. So what does that look like when we inevitably at some point in time in the future will hit a prolonged downturn again, right? So whether that's in 2026 or not, we don't know. But as a dismal economist, we always believe eventually it will come again. So take that into account. A few things here to kind of take a look at, helpful links, resources. So the online tool is that one that we went through together, dmc.vosic.io. Also, if you just Google dairy margin tool or DMC tool Bosic, it should come up. How to enroll, contact your FSA service center. And then there's a service center locator there. The additional links and resources on the tools, as well as some of the other risk management options that you might want to consider from DRP, LGM Dairy, and then the places to find that information as well. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be put up online. So that way, if you're not able to capture all of this detail right now, you will have the chance to go back and take a look. Also, again, encourage you to scan this QR code, go to that survey, and ask those deeper questions that you have, the things that have been rattling around in your brain, whether that's on dairy margin coverage, risk management, or other topics in dairy. Would love to hear it, so that way we can put some time and effort and focus on answering your questions specifically that are out there in the dairy industry. So. With that, we do put a lot of information out on the Topic Hub on our website for the UW-Madison. This takes you there, so feel free to scan that one as well, or you can go to go.wisc.edu/dairy markets. And with that, I do encourage you to ask questions if there aren't any. Otherwise, happy to provide any additional information that folks might be looking for.
Thank you so much, Leonard. Uh, we do have quite a few participants on our Zoom. If you do have any questions, feel free to stay on and put those in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll give it a couple minutes here. And like Leonard said, we're going to have the webinar is being recorded. We're going to transcribe it, and then we'll get it up on the website under Farm Management, UW-Madison Division of Extension Topic Hub, and then also on our Dairy Topic Hub.
So while we wait for questions, one thing I did this morning here was I just took a look at one futures contract month and then looked at what a put option would be on that. And when you kind of take a look at, I'll share my screen here quickly so that way it makes a little more sense too. When you take a look at the dairy margin coverage, and if you're covering this 6 million pounds and you're paying $8,550 to do it, when I compared that to just the class 3 options premium, which is this is a June contract, and our current strike price is that $17.17. So if we're pick something that's close to that here is this 82 cents. And if you do the math and you figure out how many pounds of production that you're covering a floor on by using that options contract. And again, I know these aren't comparable things, right? Like DMC, we're covering a margin, which is income over feed. And when you're buying a put on the CME futures, you're just covering that floor, right? But nonetheless, I think is an interesting, at least thought experiment here. But if you take that option premium and then calculate it back out to figure out if you're going to spend this exact same $8,550 here through the dairy margin coverage program, you're covering 6 million, well, just under that, right? Because you have the 95% coverage level. So let's call it 5,770 pounds of annual production. And for that same exact money, utilizing that put option, you would cover about 1 million pounds, right? So a little over that. So, you know, I think that's up to you, the producer, to figure out how you want to allocate your funds, how you want to do things. But I think when you look at this and the value it provides from that risk management standpoint, if you're looking at it compared to other choices, I think that it should definitely be in that consideration set for sure when looking at any sort of risk management choices in that toolkit that's available to you. So I'll put this back up one more time here. I won't share the screen in case anybody wants to try to get either of these, but if there's anything that folks want more of or additional questions, happy to do it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.